The story I'm about to tell you is a true and real story. If you have the courage, you will listen to this story carefully. In the winter of 1903, federal investigators arrived at the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium in the remote Colorado Rockies to find something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Behind a false wall in the sanatorium's basement, they discovered a hand-carved crypt containing exactly 84 human skeletons, each tagged with a name, date of arrival, and final entry, ascended to heaven through divine healing. For 21 years, the Crawford family had operated what they called a revolutionary Christian medical facility, promising miraculous cures for tuberculosis and other terminal diseases. Wealthy patients from across America had traveled to this isolated mountain sanctuary, seeking salvation for their dying bodies. None of them ever left alive. The truth investigators uncovered was so disturbing that the federal government sealed the case files for 30 years, and the local community agreed to never speak of what happened at Mountain View again. This isn't just another story about medical malpractice or religious fraud. This is the account of the most calculated systematic killing scheme ever perpetrated under the guise of divine healing in American history. Before we dive into the horrifying details of how the Crawford family turned faith into a weapon of mass murder, hit that subscribe button if you have the courage to hear stories that most channels won't dare tell. Comment below and let me know what state you're listening from, because this story could have happened anywhere desperate people sought miracles. Only true mystery seekers can handle what we're about to uncover. But to understand how 84 souls met their fate in those mountains, we need to go back to where it all began. In the autumn of 1882, when the first patient arrived at what would become Colorado's most deadly secret, the territory that would become Elkhorn County, Colorado, was barely more than a collection of mining settlements and ranch outposts when Dr. William Crawford first arrived in September 1882. At 34, Crawford was a man of impressive credentials. A graduate of Harvard Medical School, former surgeon in the Union Army, and a published researcher in what he called faith-based therapeutic medicine. He carried with him letters of recommendation from prominent physicians in Boston and New York, along with a vision that would, he claimed, revolutionize the treatment of incurable diseases. Crawford wasn't alone in his mountain pilgrimage. His sister Mary Crawford had dedicated her life to what she called nursing ministry, after surviving a bout of consumption that doctors had declared terminal. At 29, Sister Mary possessed a gentle demeanor that masked an iron will and an unwavering belief that God spoke directly to her about patient care. Their cousin, Reverend James Crawford, completed the trio, a charismatic preacher who had been expelled from 2 different Presbyterian congregations for what church elders euphemistically called theological irregularities. James possessed a voice that could fill a cathedral and a presence that seemed to draw suffering souls like moths to a flame. The location they chose for their sanatorium was both breathtaking and ominous. Perched on a natural shelf of granite 8,000 ft above sea level, the site offered panoramic views of snow-capped peaks that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. The nearest town, Elkhorn, was a full day's ride down treacherous mountain trails, accessible only by a single wagon road that became impassable for months during the harsh Colorado winters. It was, William Crawford declared, the perfect place for patients to commune with the divine while receiving the most advanced medical care available. Construction of the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium began immediately, funded by what Crawford claimed was a substantial inheritance from a deceased uncle in Massachusetts. The main building was an imposing 3-story structure of local timber and stone, designed to house 30 patients in private rooms that Crawford insisted must have unobstructed views of God's creation. A separate chapel capable of seating 50 was built adjacent to the main facility, its bell tower visible from the valley below. Most mysteriously, Crawford ordered the construction of what he called meditation chambers, a series of rooms carved directly into the granite mountainside behind the sanatorium, connected to the main building by a tunnel system that workers were ordered to keep strictly confidential. The isolation of Mountain View was both its greatest selling point and its most sinister feature. Crawford advertised the facility as a sanctuary where patients could heal without the corrupting influences of modern society. But the reality was far more calculating. No postal service reached the sanatorium directly. All mail was collected from Elkhorn and brought up the mountain by Crawford's private courier. Telegraph lines had been installed during construction, but the single wire was controlled entirely by the sanatorium staff. Most crucially, the nearest law enforcement was the county sheriff in Elkhorn, a man named Frank Jameson, who had been generously compensated by the Crawfords for his discretion regarding medical confidentiality. By the spring of 1883, the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium was ready to receive its first patients. The Crawfords had spent months crafting their reputation through carefully placed advertisements in newspapers across the East Coast and Midwest. Their message was simple but powerful. Traditional medicine had failed where faith-based healing could succeed. They claimed to have developed a revolutionary treatment protocol that combined the latest medical advances with the healing power of prayer and divine intervention. Testimonials from grateful patients filled their promotional materials. Though none of these patients could ever be contacted directly, they had all, according to the Crawfords, requested complete privacy during their spiritual journey toward wellness. The first patient to arrive at Mountain View was Margaret Thornton, a 42-year-old widow from Philadelphia, whose tuberculosis had been declared terminal by 3 different physicians. She brought with her a small fortune in gold coins and government bonds, along with a desperate hope that the mountain air and Christian healing might grant her the miracle that medicine had failed to provide. On May 15, 1883, Margaret's carriage disappeared into the mountain mists, carrying her toward what she believed would be her salvation. She would never be seen alive again. The morning of May 16, 1883, dawned crisp and clear at Mountain View Sanatorium with the kind of crystalline mountain air that seemed to promise healing to anyone brave enough to breathe it deeply. Margaret Thornton had spent her first night in what Dr. Crawford called the orientation chamber, a comfortable room on the 2nd floor where new patients were encouraged to cleanse their spirits before beginning the sacred journey toward wellness. She had written in her journal, found later by investigators, that she felt more hopeful than I have in months, surrounded by such devoted Christian souls. The daily routine at Mountain View followed what the Crawfords called the divine schedule. Patients rose at dawn for meditation in their rooms, followed by a communal breakfast in the main dining hall, where Dr. Crawford would deliver what he called therapeutic sermons, carefully crafted speeches that combined medical terminology with religious fervor. The body, he would proclaim, is merely the vessel for the soul, and when the soul is properly aligned with divine will, the flesh must follow. Sister Mary would move between the tables, dispensing what she called morning blessings, small cups of herbal tea that she claimed contained mountain herbs blessed through prayer. After breakfast, patients participated in what Crawford termed active healing sessions, group meetings held in the chapel where Reverend James would lead increasingly intense prayer circles. These sessions, according to later testimonies from former employees, became progressively more theatrical as patients grew weaker. James Crawford possessed an uncanny ability to sense when a patient was approaching what he called the threshold of transformation, the point where their illness had advanced beyond any hope of recovery. It was then that the real nature of Mountain View's healing would begin. Margaret Thornton's transformation began on her 3rd day at the sanatorium. During the morning therapeutic sermon, Dr. Crawford announced that she had been selected by divine providence for an accelerated healing protocol. This was, he explained to the other patients, a great honor, reserved only for those whose faith had reached a level of purity that allowed them to transcend the limitations of earthly medicine. Margaret was moved to a private room in the basement level, what the Crawfords called the sanctification chamber, where she would undergo intensive treatment away from the other patients. The sanctification chamber was one of the rooms carved directly into the granite mountainside, accessible only through the tunnel system that connected to the main building. The walls were lined with religious iconography, crosses, biblical verses, and paintings of saints in various stages of martyrdom. A single oil lamp provided dim illumination, and the air carried the perpetual scent of incense mixed with something else, something sweet and cloying that would later be identified as chloroform. In the center of the room stood what appeared to be a medical examination table, but closer inspection revealed leather restraints at the head, wrists, and ankles. Dr. Crawford's treatment protocol was as methodical as it was deadly. Patients selected for accelerated healing were given increasingly larger doses of morphine administered under the guise of divine pain relief. Sister Mary would sit beside them reading from Scripture and reassuring them that their suffering was purifying their souls for the journey ahead. As the morphine took effect, Reverend James would conduct what he called the final prayer, a ceremony where he would place his hands on the patient's head and declare them ready for ascension. The actual moment of death was always carefully orchestrated. Dr. Crawford would increase the morphine dosage to lethal levels, while Sister Mary continued her scriptural recitations. The patient would slip into unconsciousness, their breathing becoming slower and shallower until finally stopping altogether. At the precise moment of death, Reverend James would raise his hands and proclaim, "Behold, another soul has been healed and called home to glory." The entire process was designed to appear as if the patient had died peacefully during a profound spiritual experience. Margaret Thornton's death occurred on the evening of May 19, 1883, exactly 4 days after her arrival. According to the detailed records found by investigators, she had been given a total of 340 mg of morphine over the course of 6 hours, more than enough to kill 3 healthy adults. Her final words, recorded by Sister Mary in what she called the Book of Sacred Transitions, were allegedly, "I can see the light. I am healed at last." Whether Margaret actually spoke these words, or whether they were simply invented for the record, would never be known. The disposal of Margaret's body revealed the true scope of the Crawfords' planning. A corpse was carried through the tunnel system to a natural cave that had been enlarged and modified during the sanatorium's construction. Here, Dr. Crawford had created what he called the eternal resting place, a carefully organized crypt where bodies were laid out on stone shelves carved directly into the granite walls. Each body was tagged with a metal plate containing the patient's name, date of arrival, and date of ascension. Margaret Thornton became the first entry in what would eventually become a catalog of 84 murders. But the death was only the beginning of the Crawford scheme. Within hours of Margaret's passing, Dr. Crawford was composing a letter to her family in Philadelphia. The letter, written on official sanatorium letterhead, contained news that would have seemed like a miracle to anyone who didn't know the truth. Margaret had experienced what Crawford called complete spiritual healing. Her tuberculosis had been entirely cured through the power of prayer and divine intervention. However, she had decided to remain at Mountain View indefinitely, dedicating her life to helping other patients experience similar miracles. She had requested that her family respect her privacy during this sacred period of service and not attempt to contact her directly. The letter also contained practical instructions regarding Margaret's estate. Since she'd chosen to devote her life to the sanatorium's healing mission, she was donating her worldly possessions to support the facility's divine work. Dr. Crawford helpfully provided the necessary legal documentation, powers of attorney, and property transfer documents that bore Margaret's signature, perfectly forged by Sister Mary, who had spent years perfecting the art of copying handwriting from patient intake forms. Margaret Thornton's family, devastated by years of watching their loved one waste away from consumption, received the news with a mixture of joy and confusion. The idea that she had been miraculously healed seemed too good to be true. But the official documentation and Dr. Crawford's medical credentials lent credibility to the incredible claim. When they attempted to send letters directly to Margaret, they were told that she was undergoing intensive spiritual preparation and could not receive correspondence. The family's modest attempts to visit were gently but firmly discouraged. Such visits, they were told, could interfere with Margaret's delicate spiritual state and potentially reverse her miraculous healing. Within 6 months, Margaret Thornton's entire estate, valued at approximately $18,000 in gold and property, had been transferred to the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium. Her family, believing their loved one was alive and serving God in the mountains, felt they had no choice but to respect her wishes. They had no way of knowing that Margaret had been dead for months, her body lying in a granite tomb, while the Crawfords spent her money on expanding their facility and attracting new victims. The success of Margaret's case established the template that would be used for the next 20 years. The Crawfords had discovered that the combination of genuine medical credentials, religious authority, and geographic isolation created the perfect conditions for systematic murder. More importantly, they had learned that families of terminally ill patients were so desperate for hope that they would believe almost any story that promised their loved one had been saved. By the summer of 1884, the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium had gained a reputation across the American West as a place where miracles happened regularly. Word of Margaret Thornton's miraculous healing had spread through the networks of desperate families dealing with terminal illnesses, and Dr. Crawford found himself receiving inquiries from as far away as California and New York. The sanatorium's guest book, a leather-bound ledger that Crawford kept meticulously updated, showed a steady stream of wealthy patients seeking the divine healing that traditional medicine had failed to provide. The second victim was Theodore Bancroft, a railroad magnate from Chicago whose lung condition had been steadily worsening despite the best medical care money could buy. Bancroft arrived at Mountain View in July 1884 with a personal fortune that dwarfed Margaret Thornton's modest inheritance. He brought with him not only gold and securities worth over $75,000, but also a burning desire to live long enough to see his young grandson grow up. Bancroft's wife had died 3 years earlier, and he had convinced himself that God was testing his faith by afflicting him with the same wasting disease that had claimed her. The Crawfords' approach to Bancroft was more sophisticated than their treatment of Margaret. They had learned from their first success that wealthy patients required more elaborate attention to maintain the illusion of revolutionary medical care. Dr. Crawford spent hours with Bancroft explaining his theories about the connection between spiritual wellness and physical health. He showed him charts and diagrams that appeared to be cutting-edge medical research, but were actually carefully crafted forgeries designed to support his claims about faith-based healing. Sister Mary took particular interest in Bancroft's emotional state, spending long evenings listening to his fears about death and his guilt over what he perceived as a life of excessive material focus. She guided him through what she called spiritual inventory sessions, detailed confessions where patients were encouraged to examine their lives for sins that might be preventing divine healing. These sessions served a dual purpose. They provided psychological insight that helped the Crawfords manipulate their victims, and they often revealed information about hidden assets or family secrets that could be exploited later. Reverend James conducted special healing services for Bancroft, complete with what he claimed were prophetic visions about the man's future. In elaborate ceremonies held in the chapel, James would fall into apparent trances and deliver messages that he claimed came directly from God. These messages always contained the same basic elements. Bancroft's illness was a test of his faith. His healing was assured if he remained committed to the process, and he was being prepared for a special mission that would require him to stay at Mountain View for an extended period. The psychological manipulation was masterful. Bancroft, isolated from his normal support systems and surrounded by people who claimed to have his spiritual welfare at heart, gradually became completely dependent on the Crawfords' version of reality. When Dr. Crawford suggested that Bancroft's business interests were creating spiritual impediments to his healing, the railroad magnate began signing over control of his companies to trustees recommended by the sanatorium. When Sister Mary observed that his attachment to worldly possessions was preventing complete surrender to God's will, he donated increasingly large sums to the facility's operations. Bancroft's ascension took place on September 23, 1884, following the same carefully orchestrated protocol that had been used with Margaret Thornton. The morphine doses were administered over the course of a week, with Dr. Crawford explaining that the increasing drowsiness was actually a sign of spiritual deepening. Sister Mary maintained a constant vigil, reading from Scripture and assuring Bancroft that his visions of deceased loved ones were evidence of his approaching reunion with God. Reverend James performed the final ceremony with even greater theatrical flair, declaring that he could see angels descending to escort Bancroft's soul to heaven. The letter to Bancroft's family was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Dr. Crawford reported that Theodore had experienced not just physical healing, but a profound spiritual transformation that had called him to dedicate his remaining years to helping other suffering souls. He had decided to remain at Mountain View as a healing minister, using his business expertise to help expand the facility's divine mission. The letter included detailed instructions about estate management and a request that the family respect Theodore's need for privacy during his sacred service period. Bancroft's son, a successful lawyer in Chicago, was more skeptical than Margaret Thornton's family had been. He hired private investigators to look into the Mountain View Sanatorium and its mysterious healing claims. However, the investigators found exactly what the Crawfords wanted them to find: a legitimate medical facility operated by credentialed professionals with testimonials from satisfied patients and documentation of successful treatments. The isolation that made Mountain View Perfect for murder also made it nearly impossible to investigate. Effectively, when the investigators attempted to visit the sanatorium directly, they were told that Theodore was undergoing intensive treatment and could not receive visitors. Dr. Crawford provided them with a letter allegedly written by Theodore himself, expressing his wishes to remain undisturbed during his healing process. The handwriting was perfect. Sister Mary had spent months perfecting Theodore's signature and writing style from the extensive correspondence he had conducted during his stay. The pattern was now established, and the Crawfords began accepting patients at an increasingly rapid pace. By the end of 1884, 7 more patients had ascended to heaven through the Mountain View Healing Protocol. Each death followed the same script: careful psychological preparation, gradual morphine poisoning, theatrical spiritual ceremony, and immediate notification to families about miraculous healing and voluntary isolation. The sanatorium's underground crypt was expanding, with new chambers being carved into the granite to accommodate the growing collection of victims. The wealth flowing into Mountain View was staggering. In less than 2 years, the Crawfords had accumulated over $300,000 in cash and securities from their murdered patients, equivalent to more than $8 million in today's currency. They used this money to expand the facility, adding a second building for advanced healing chambers, and hiring additional staff members who were carefully selected for their willingness to ask no questions and accept generous compensation for their discretion. But the true genius of the Crawfords' operation was not just the systematic murder of their patients. It was the way they had created a self-sustaining mythology that attracted new victims. Each successful healing story spread through networks of desperate families, creating a reputation that drew more wealthy patients to their mountain sanctuary. The isolation that made investigation impossible also made their victims' disappearances seem voluntary and spiritual rather than sinister. The staff at Mountain View had been carefully chosen for their combination of medical competence and moral flexibility. Dr. Harrison Blake, a surgeon who had lost his license in Kansas for performing unnecessary operations, served as Crawford's assistant physician. Nurse Elizabeth Hartwell, who had been dismissed from 2 different hospitals for suspicious patient deaths, worked closely with Sister Mary in administering the fatal morphine doses. Even the facility's cook, Mrs. Sarah Bennett, had been selected because her previous employment at a prison had made her comfortable with secrets and isolation. These accomplices were well compensated for their participation in the murders. Each received a generous salary plus bonuses for maintaining absolute secrecy about the sanatorium's operations. They were also provided with carefully crafted cover stories that explained their presence at Mountain View as legitimate medical work in an innovative healing facility. If questioned by outsiders, they had detailed explanations about the sanatorium's revolutionary treatment methods and the remarkable success rates they were witnessing. The psychological dynamics among the staff created an environment where murder became routine. Dr. Crawford positioned himself as a visionary leader who was pioneering a new form of medical care that transcended traditional boundaries between physical and spiritual healing. Sister Mary convinced herself that they were providing genuine mercy to terminally ill patients, ending their suffering while ensuring their souls achieved salvation. Reverend James proclaimed that they were instruments of divine will, called to help souls transition from earthly pain to heavenly glory. As 1885 began, the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium had become a perfectly functioning death machine disguised as a medical facility and protected by geographic isolation, religious authority, and the desperate hopes of grieving families. The Crawfords had learned to select their victims carefully, targeting wealthy individuals with terminal illnesses whose families would be most likely to believe stories of miraculous healing. They had perfected their methods of psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and systematic murder. But most terrifyingly, they had discovered that their crimes were not only sustainable, but profitable beyond their wildest imagination. The combination of regular income from murdered patients and the expanding reputation of their facility meant that new victims were arriving faster than they could be processed. The granite crypt beneath Mountain View was growing larger each month, filled with the bodies of people who had come seeking healing and found only death. What none of them realized was that their success was about to attract the attention of someone who would prove far more dangerous than any government investigator or suspicious family member. Someone who had been watching their operations from the shadows and planning. their own approach to the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium. The spring of 1888 brought an unexpected visitor to the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium, one whose arrival would mark the beginning of the end for the Crawfords' deadly enterprise. Dr. Samuel Richardson was not a patient seeking healing, but a physician investigating reports of miraculous cures that had begun circulating in medical journals across the country. Richardson, a respected member of the American Medical Association and a specialist in pulmonary diseases, had been commissioned by the Boston Medical Society to investigate claims that a Colorado facility was achieving impossible cure rates for tuberculosis and other terminal conditions. Richardson's credentials were impeccable, his reputation unassailable, and his investigative methods thorough. Unlike the private investigators hired by suspicious families, Richardson understood exactly what questions to ask and what evidence to look for. He arrived at Mountain View in May 1888, presenting himself as a physician interested in learning about the sanatorium's innovative treatment methods. Dr. Crawford, flattered by the attention from such a distinguished colleague, welcomed Richardson with open arms and began what would prove to be a fatal mistake. He started showing off. The guided tour of Mountain View that Crawford provided was designed to impress Richardson with the facility's medical sophistication and spiritual atmosphere. Crawford proudly displayed his treatment rooms, laboratory facilities, and patient quarters, explaining his theories about the connection between faith and healing. He showed Richardson the chapel where Reverend James conducted healing services, the meditation chambers where patients underwent spiritual preparation, and the medical library where he claimed to conduct research on divine healing protocols. But Richardson was trained to observe details that escaped casual visitors. He noticed that the facility's medical equipment was limited and outdated, hardly sufficient for the revolutionary treatments Crawford claimed to be administering. The laboratory contained basic chemical supplies, but none of the advanced diagnostic tools that would be necessary for monitoring patients with serious illnesses. Most importantly, Richardson observed that despite claims of housing 30 patients, the sanatorium seemed remarkably quiet and empty. When Richardson asked to meet with some of the patients who had been successfully treated, Crawford explained that most had chosen to remain at Mountain View as healing ministers, but were currently engaged in intensive spiritual retreats that required complete isolation. The few patients who were visible appeared to be in the early stages of their treatment, showing no signs of the miraculous recoveries that had made the sanatorium famous. Richardson's medical eye detected that several of these patients were actually becoming progressively sicker rather than better. Richardson's most significant discovery came during his examination of the sanatorium's medical records. Crawford, eager to demonstrate his scientific approach to faith-based healing, proudly showed Richardson his detailed patient files. These records, which Crawford believed supported his claims of revolutionary medical success, actually contained evidence of systematic murder. Richardson noticed that patient symptoms consistently worsened over time. Despite reports of miraculous healing, he observed that morphine usage was extraordinarily high, far beyond what would be medically justified for pain management. Most suspiciously, he detected patterns in the handwriting of patient letters that suggested forgery. The turning point came when Richardson requested permission to conduct independent medical examinations of patients who had allegedly been cured. Dr. Crawford, unable to produce living patients who showed evidence of miraculous healing, began making increasingly elaborate excuses. He claimed that divine healing was so delicate that outside medical examination could reverse the process. He insisted that the patient's spiritual state was so advanced that they could no longer tolerate contact with physicians, or who lacked proper faith. He even suggested that Richardson's scientific skepticism was creating negative spiritual energy that could harm the healing process. Richardson's suspicions crystallized during a conversation with Mrs. Sarah Bennett, the facility's cook. Unlike the other staff members, Mrs. Bennett had not been thoroughly briefed on the cover story, and she made several casual comments that revealed the true nature of Mountain View's operations. She mentioned that the facility went through an unusual amount of morphine for a healing center. She observed that patients seemed to become progressively more religious and detached from worldly concerns as their treatment progressed. Most damning, she commented that it was remarkable how many patients chose to remain at the facility permanently after being cured, never wanting to return to their families. That evening, Richardson made a discovery that confirmed his worst fears. While exploring the facility's basement levels, discovered the entrance to the tunnel system that connected to the granite caves. Following the tunnels, he found the carved chambers where the Crawfords conducted their murder rituals. The room still contained the medical equipment to administer lethal morphine doses, along with religious paraphernalia designed to create the illusion of spiritual healing. Most horrifyingly, Richardson found the detailed records that Sister Mary had kept of each patient's final moments. Records that revealed the true nature of their ascension to heaven. Richardson's investigation took on new urgency when he realized that the Crawfords were planning to murder him as well. His questions had become too specific, his observations too accurate, and his credentials too impressive to dismiss. Dr. Crawford began suggesting that Richardson himself might benefit from the sanatorium's healing treatments, commenting that his skeptical nature suggested spiritual illness that required treatment. Sister Mary started preparing what she called special refreshments for Richardson's meals, and Reverend James began conducting private prayer sessions designed to evaluate Richardson's spiritual readiness for advanced healing protocols. The crisis came to a head on Richardson's fifth night at Mountain View. He had been experiencing increasingly severe drowsiness after meals, and his medical training told him that he was being gradually poisoned with morphine. That night he pretended to drink the tea that Sister Mary brought to his room, but secretly disposed of it and remained awake to observe the facility's nighttime activities. What he witnessed confirmed his worst fears about the true nature of Mountain View's operations. Through his bedroom window, Richardson saw Dr. Crawford and his assistants moving through the facility's corridors, checking on patients and administering what appeared to be medical treatments. But Richardson's trained eye recognized the signs of systematic murder in progress. He watched as they entered the rooms of patients who had been selected for accelerated healing, administering increasing doses of morphine while conducting the religious ceremonies that accompanied each death. He saw the bodies being removed through the tunnel system and transported to the underground crypt where previous victims had been stored. The next morning, Richardson made his escape from Mountain View, using his knowledge of the mountain trails to avoid the main road where the Crawfords would expect him to travel. He carried with him detailed notes about the facility's operations, copies of medical records that proved systematic murder, and most importantly, a clear understanding of how the Crawfords had been able to operate undetected for so long. He also carried the terrible knowledge that dozens of people had been murdered while their families believed they were receiving miraculous healing. Richardson's journey down the mountain was treacherous, but his determination to expose the truth drove him through dangers that would have stopped a less motivated man. He knew that every hour he delayed meant that more innocent people might arrive at Mountain View seeking healing and finding only death. He also knew that the Crawfords would soon discover his escape and begin covering their tracks, destroying evidence and potentially killing any remaining witnesses to their crimes. When Richardson finally reached Elkhorn, he immediately contacted federal authorities and began the process that would ultimately bring down the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium. But the Crawfords had not survived 6 years of systematic murder without developing contingency plans for exactly this situation. They had prepared for the possibility that their operations might be discovered, and they were ready to implement measures that would be even more horrifying than the murders they had already committed. The race between Richardson's investigation and the Crawfords' cover-up would determine not only whether justice would be served, but whether the full scope of their crimes would ever be revealed. In the mountains above Elkhorn, the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium was about to become the scene of its final and most terrifying chapter. Dr. Richardson's escape from Mountain View on that fog-shrouded morning in June 1888 triggered a series of events that would transform the sanatorium from a functioning murder operation into a scene of unprecedented horror. The Crawfords discovered Richardson's departure within hours, and their reaction revealed the true depths of their depravity. Rather than fleeing or attempting to cover their tracks, they made a decision that would haunt investigators for decades. They decided to eliminate all evidence of their crimes by murdering every remaining patient and staff member at the facility. The decision was reached during an emergency meeting in Dr. Crawford's private office with Sister Mary and Reverend James. President Dr. Crawford had found Richardson's discarded teacup and realized that their carefully planned murder had been discovered. The medical records that Richardson had been examining were missing, along with several other documents that could provide evidence of the systematic killings. But what terrified Crawford most was their realization that Richardson possessed the medical knowledge necessary to expose their methods and the professional credentials to ensure that his accusations would be taken seriously by authorities. Sister Mary, who had spent 6 years convincing herself that their murders were acts of divine mercy, finally revealed the full extent of her psychological deterioration. She proclaimed that Richardson's escape was actually part of God's plan, a test of their faith that required them to complete their sacred mission before earthly authorities could interfere. She had received, she claimed, a divine vision that instructed them to harvest the remaining souls before abandoning their earthly work. Her religious delusions had become so complete that she genuinely believed murder was a form of salvation. Reverend James, whose theatrical spirituality had always masked a calculating ruthlessness, saw the situation in purely practical terms. They had accumulated over $800,000 in assets from their murdered patients. But this wealth would be meaningless if they were captured and executed for their crimes. The remaining patients at Mountain View represented both potential witnesses and additional sources of income that could fund their escape. His plan was characteristically brutal: kill everyone at the facility, destroy all evidence, and disappear with their accumulated wealth before authorities could arrive. The final harvest, as the Crawfords came to call it, began that very evening. The facility currently housed 12 patients in various stages of treatment, along with 6 staff members who had been complicit in the murders. The Crawfords' plan was to eliminate all 18 people over the course of a single night, making their deaths appear to be the result of a tragic accident or natural disaster that would explain the disappearance of everyone at Mountain View. The method they chose was both efficient and horrifying. Dr. Crawford had access to chloroform in quantities sufficient to kill dozens of people, and the facility's isolated location meant that screams would not be heard by anyone who might provide rescue. The plan was to gas each room systematically, beginning with the staff quarters and moving through the patient areas, ensuring that no one would survive to tell authorities what had really happened at Mountain View. Mrs. Sarah Bennett, the cook who had inadvertently provided Richardson with crucial information, was the first to die. Sister Mary entered her room shortly after midnight, ostensibly to check on her health, but actually to administer a chloroform-soaked cloth that rendered her unconscious within minutes. As Mrs. Bennett struggled weakly against the suffocating chemical, Sister Mary whispered prayers over her, convinced that she was providing spiritual comfort during the transition to death. The cook's body was immediately moved to the underground crypt, where it joined the dozens of previous victims. The systematic murder of the staff continued throughout the early morning hours. Dr. Blake, the assistant physician who had participated in numerous patient killings, was eliminated in his sleep by Dr. Crawford personally. Nurse Hartwell, who had administered countless lethal morphine doses, was killed by Reverend James using a combination of chloroform and manual strangulation. The facility's maintenance workers, groundskeepers, and administrative staff were murdered one by one, their bodies disposed of in the ever-expanding granite crypt. The patient murders were conducted with the same ritualistic attention to detail that had characterized the Crawfords' operations throughout their 6 years of killing. Each patient was approached individually, with Sister Mary providing religious comfort while Dr. Crawford administered the fatal doses of morphine and chloroform. Reverend James performed abbreviated versions of his ascension ceremonies, proclaiming that each soul was being called home to glory. The patients, already weakened by their genuine illnesses and months of gradual poisoning, offered little resistance to their murders. Among the final victims was Elizabeth Hartwell, a 63-year-old woman from Denver, whose lung condition had brought her to Mountain View 3 months earlier. Elizabeth had written regularly to her daughter, describing the wonderful care she was receiving and the spiritual growth she was experiencing. Her letters, all forged by Sister Mary, had convinced her family that she was finally finding peace after years of suffering. Elizabeth's actual death was neither peaceful nor spiritual. She died alone in her room, murdered by people she had trusted with her life, while her family believed she was receiving miraculous healing. The youngest victim of the final harvest was Timothy Morrison, a 17-year-old boy whose parents had brought him to Mountain View as a last resort after traditional medicine had failed to cure his tuberculosis. Timothy had shown signs of improvement during his first weeks at the facility, leading his parents to believe that the divine healing might actually be working. In reality, his improvement had been their salt of the mountain air and rest, and Dr. Crawford had been gradually increasing his morphine doses in preparation for his eventual murder. Timothy's death was particularly brutal. He regained consciousness during the chloroform administration and fought desperately against his killers before finally succumbing. The murders continued until dawn, when the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium had been transformed into a carol house containing the bodies of 18 people. The Crawfords spent the following day systematically destroying evidence of their crimes, burning medical records, patient correspondence, and financial documents. They dismantled the laboratory equipment, removed religious artifacts from the chapel, and prepared to abandon the facility that had been their base of operations for 6 years of systematic murder. But their escape plan contained a fatal flaw that would ultimately lead to their capture and the discovery of their crimes. The Crawfords had become so confident in their ability to manipulate and kill that they had grown careless about covering their tracks. More importantly, they had underestimated both the determination of Dr. Richardson and the efficiency of federal law enforcement when presented with credible evidence of mass murder. Dr. Richardson's arrival in Denver on June 15, 1888 marked the beginning of the most intensive criminal investigation in Colorado Territory's history. Richardson had ridden nearly 60 mi through treacherous mountain terrain, carrying with him evidence that would expose the most systematic killing operation ever discovered in the American West. His first stop was the federal marshal's office, where he presented Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrison with medical records, patient files, and detailed observations that painted a horrifying picture of the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium. Marshal Garrison was initially skeptical of Richardson's claims. The idea that a legitimate medical facility operated by credentialed professionals could be systematically murdering patients seemed too incredible to believe. However, Richardson's reputation as a respected physician and his detailed knowledge of medical procedures gave weight to his accusations. More importantly, Richardson had brought with him physical evidence that supported his claims. Morphine vials with suspicious markings, patient records showing impossible cure rates, and handwriting samples that suggested widespread forgery. The federal investigation began immediately with Garrison organizing a team of 12 marshals to accompany him to Mountain View. The team included medical examiners, handwriting experts, and experienced criminal investigators who would be able to analyze the evidence that Richardson had described. They also brought with them arrest warrants for the 3 Crawfords based on Richardson's sworn testimony about the murders he had witnessed. But when the federal team arrived at Mountain View on June 18th, they found something far worse than Richardson had described. The sanatorium appeared to be completely abandoned, with no signs of the patients or staff who should have been present at a functioning medical facility. The buildings were empty, with furniture covered by sheets and medical equipment removed or destroyed. Most ominously, there were signs of recent fires in several areas, suggesting that someone had been systematically destroying evidence. The discovery of the underground crypt system revealed the true scope of the Crawfords' crimes. Following the tunnel system that Richardson had described, investigators found the carved granite chambers that had served as both murder rooms and storage areas for victims' bodies. The crypt contained exactly 84 human skeletons, each carefully tagged with metal plates bearing names and dates. The organization was meticulous. Bodies were arranged chronologically, by date of death, with detailed records showing the progression of the murders over 6 years. The investigation of the crypt revealed evidence that would haunt the federal marshals for the rest of their lives. Many of the skeletons showed signs of violence beyond simple poisoning, broken bones that suggested struggles, skull fractures that indicated beatings, and restraint marks that proved victims had been tied down during their murders. The most recent bodies, those killed during the final harvest, still showed traces of the chloroform that had been used to kill them. The entire crypt reeked of death and decay, with the sweet smell of decomposition mixing with the chemical odor of embalming fluids and medical preservatives. The paper trail that investigators discovered in the partially destroyed records told an even more disturbing story. The Crawfords had kept detailed financial records of their operation, showing that they had accumulated over $1.2 million from their murdered patients. They had maintained careful logs of morphine purchases, chloroform acquisitions, and body disposal procedures. Most chilling were Sister Mary's spiritual journals, which revealed her complete psychological breakdown and her genuine belief that she was performing acts of divine mercy by murdering suffering patients. The hunt for the fleeing Crawfords became a nationwide manhunt, with federal marshals coordinating with local law enforcement across the Western Territories. The Crawfords had a significant head start. They had fled Mountain View immediately after completing the final harvest, taking with them a substantial portion of their accumulated wealth. However, their distinctive appearance and the notoriety of their crimes made them difficult to hide, and witness reports began coming in from towns across Colorado, Utah, and Nevada. The breakthrough in the investigation came from an unexpected source. James Palmer, a former patient at Mountain View who had escaped before his scheduled murder, came forward when news of the investigation became public. Palmer had been treated at the facility in early 1887 for a lung condition, and he had become suspicious of the treatment methods when other patients began disappearing under mysterious circumstances. He had faked his own death by bribing a maintenance worker, then fled the facility under cover of darkness. Palmer's testimony provided investigators with crucial details about the Crawfords' methods and motivations. He described the psychological manipulation techniques they used to gain control over patients, the gradual increase in morphine doses that preceded each murder, and the elaborate religious ceremonies that accompanied the killings. Most importantly, Palmer was able to provide investigators with information about the Crawfords' escape plans, including safe houses they had established and contacts they had cultivated for use in emergencies. The federal investigation also uncovered evidence of official corruption that had allowed the Crawfords to operate undetected for so long. Sheriff Frank Jameson of Elkhorn had been receiving regular payments to ignore suspicious activities at Mountain View and to discourage outside investigation of the facility. Local postal workers had been bribed to intercept mail intended for patients and to forward forged correspondence to families. Even the telegraph operator who maintained communications with the outside world had been part of the conspiracy, helping to maintain the illusion that patients were alive and well when they had actually been murdered. The corruption investigation revealed that the Crawfords had spent nearly $50,000 over 6 years to maintain their network of accomplices and informants. They had systematically identified key officials whose cooperation was necessary for their operation and had either bribed or intimidated them into compliance. The scope of their influence extended beyond Elkhorn County to include officials in Denver and other major cities who had helped them maintain their medical credentials and professional reputation. If you're finding this investigation as chilling as we are, and you're wondering how the federal marshals finally tracked down these killers, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you think drove the Crawfords to such extreme measures. Were they motivated purely by greed, or was there something deeper and more sinister behind their systematic murders? Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime mysteries, because this story gets even more shocking as we approach the final confrontation. As the federal investigation intensified, witnesses began coming forward with information about suspicious activities they had observed over the years. Local merchants reported unusual purchases of medical supplies and chemicals by Mountain View staff. Postal workers described the large volume of mail arriving at the facility, and the strange fact that very little mail ever left the mountain. Most significantly, several families of supposed miracle healing patients began questioning the stories they had been told about their loved ones' voluntary isolation. The psychological profile that investigators developed of the Crawfords revealed 3 distinct but complementary personalities that had combined to create the perfect killing machine. Dr. William Crawford was identified as a narcissistic psychopath who viewed other people as objects to be manipulated for his own benefit. His medical training had given him the knowledge necessary to kill efficiently, while his charismatic personality had allowed him to gain the trust of vulnerable patients and their families. Sister Mary Crawford's profile was more complex and disturbing. Investigators determined that she had suffered a complete psychological break following her own recovery from tuberculosis, developing a messianic complex that convinced her she had been chosen by God to help suffering souls transition to heaven. Her detailed journals revealed a mind that had rationalized mass murder as divine mercy, with elaborate theological justifications for each killing. She had genuinely believed that she was saving her victims from earthly suffering by sending them to eternal paradise. Reverend James Crawford emerged as perhaps the most calculating of the 3 conspirators. Unlike his cousins, who had convinced themselves that their actions were justified by medical necessity or divine calling, James appeared to have been motivated purely by greed and power. His religious authority had provided the spiritual framework that made the murders acceptable to the other conspirators, while his theatrical skills had created the elaborate ceremonies that disguised systematic killing as divine healing. The federal manhunt finally tracked the Crawfords to a small mining town in Nevada, where they had been attempting to establish a new identity and begin a similar operation. Local authorities, alerted by federal marshals, had been watching the trio for several days when they attempted to purchase a large quantity of morphine from a local pharmacy. The arrest was swift and decisive. All three Crawfords were taken into custody without resistance, apparently exhausted by months of running and confident that their crimes could never be fully proven. The trial of the Crawford conspirators began in Denver in September 1888, drawing national attention as the first case of systematic medical murder to be prosecuted in American courts. The federal prosecutor, District Attorney Marcus Webb, faced the challenge of proving not only that the Crawfords had committed murder, but that they had done so as part of a deliberate and systematic scheme to defraud and kill their patients. The evidence was overwhelming, but the legal precedents for prosecuting such crimes were limited, and the defense team attempted to argue that the deaths had been the result of medical malpractice rather than intentional murder. The prosecution's case was built around three key elements: the physical evidence found at Mountain View, the testimony of survivors like James Palmer, and the detailed records that the Crawfords themselves had maintained of their operations. Dr. Richardson served as the primary expert witness, explaining to the jury how the medical procedures described in the sanatorium's records could only have been intended to cause death rather than healing. The morphine dosages, chloroform applications, and systematic progression of treatments all pointed to deliberate murder disguised as medical care. The most damaging evidence came from Sister Mary's own spiritual journals, which provided a detailed record of her psychological state and her beliefs about the murders she had committed. Her writings revealed not only her complete awareness of what they were doing, but her elaborate religious justifications for each killing. Passages where she described feeling God's presence during the murders and her certainty that she was helping souls achieve salvation provided prosecutors with clear evidence of premeditation and intent. The defense's strategy focused on attempting to portray the Crawfords as deluded religious fanatics who genuinely believed they were helping their patients. Defense attorneys argued that Sister Mary's obvious mental illness had influenced her brother and cousin, creating a shared delusion that made them believe their actions were spiritually justified. They claimed that the morphine deaths had been intended as mercy killings for terminally ill patients and that the financial fraud had been a secondary consideration rather than the primary motive. This defense strategy collapsed when prosecutors presented evidence of the Crawfords' elaborate financial planning and the systematic way they had targeted wealthy patients. The detailed records of patient assets, the forged legal documents transferring property to the sanatorium, and the careful cultivation of victim families all pointed to a scheme motivated by greed rather than religious delusion. The final harvest murders, which had included healthy staff members who posed no threat, except as potential witnesses, further undermined any claim that the killings had been motivated by mercy. The testimony of James Palmer proved to be the most compelling evidence for the prosecution. Palmer's detailed account of life inside Mountain View, his description of the psychological manipulation techniques used by the Crawfords, and his explanation of how he discovered and escaped their murder plot provided the jury with a clear picture of the systematic nature of the crimes. His testimony was particularly effective because he had no apparent motive to lie. He had escaped before, being victimized, and had come forward voluntarily to help the investigation. Dr. William Crawford's testimony in his own defense proved to be a disaster for the defense team. Under cross-examination, Crawford revealed himself to be an arrogant and manipulative individual who showed no remorse for his actions. He attempted to justify the murders as necessary medical procedures, claiming that his patients had been suffering unnecessarily and that his methods had provided them with peaceful deaths. His complete lack of empathy and his obvious pride in his medical innovations convinced the jury that they were dealing with a calculating killer rather than a deluded healer. Sister Mary's testimony was even more damaging to the defense case. Her detailed descriptions of the religious visions that had guided her actions, her certainty that she had been chosen by God to help souls transition to heaven, and her complete lack of understanding that she had committed crimes revealed a level of psychological dysfunction that made her claims of divine guidance appear obviously delusional. Her insistence that the murders had been acts of love and mercy delivered with genuine conviction and religious fervor horrified the jury and eliminated any possibility of sympathy for her mental condition. Reverend James Crawford chose not to testify in his own defense, apparently recognizing that his calculating approach to the murders would not generate jury sympathy. Instead, his attorneys attempted to portray him as a minor participant who had been manipulated by his more dominant cousins. This strategy failed when prosecutors presented evidence of James's central role in recruiting victims, conducting the murder ceremonies, and managing the financial aspects of the scheme. The prosecution's closing argument, delivered by District Attorney Webb, lasted nearly 4 hours and provided a comprehensive summary of the evidence against the Crawfords. Webb methodically demonstrated how each element of their operation, from the initial recruitment of patients to the final disposal of bodies, had been carefully planned and executed. He emphasized that the 84 murders had not been crimes of passion or accidents of medical malpractice, but the result of a deliberate scheme to use religious authority and medical credentials to exploit and kill vulnerable people. The defense closing argument attempted to generate sympathy for the defendants by emphasizing their religious backgrounds and their apparent genuine belief in divine healing. Defense attorneys argued that the Crawfords had been motivated by misguided faith rather than criminal intent, and that their actions, while tragically mistaken, had been intended to help rather than harm their patients. This argument was undermined by the overwhelming evidence of financial motivation and the systematic nature of the killings. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for all 3 defendants. The speed of the verdict reflected both the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the jury's horror at the scope and systematic nature of the crimes. Each defendant was found guilty of 84 counts of first-degree murder, along with numerous counts of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The sentencing hearing provided victims' families with their first opportunity to confront the people who had murdered their loved ones. Family members traveled from across the country to Denver, and their emotional testimony provided a powerful reminder of the human cost of the Crawfords' crimes. Margaret Thornton's sister described the years of hope and confusion her family had endured, believing that Margaret was alive and serving God in the mountains while her body was actually decomposing in a granite tomb. Theodore Bankrow's son spoke about the investigation he had conducted and his growing realization that his father had been murdered rather than healed. Judge Harrison Matthews, who presided over the sentencing, described the Crawford case as the most heinous and systematic abuse of trust ever perpetrated in American territory. He noted that the defendants had exploited not only the desperate hope of terminally ill patients, but also the religious faith of families who believed their loved ones had been miraculously healed. The systematic nature of the murders, combined with the elaborate deceptions to cover them up, represented what Judge Matthews called a corruption of everything sacred in human society. The sentences reflected the unprecedented nature of the crimes. Dr. William Crawford was sentenced to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for December 15, 1888. Sister Mary Crawford was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge noting that her obvious mental illness made the death penalty inappropriate despite the severity of her crimes. Reverend James Crawford was also sentenced to death, with his execution scheduled for the same day as his cousins. The execution of the Crawford murderers drew crowds from across Colorado territory, with thousands of people gathering in Denver to witness what newspapers called justice for the Mountain View massacres. Dr. William Crawford maintained his arrogance until the end, delivering a final statement in which he claimed that history would vindicate his medical innovations and that future generations would understand the mercy he had provided to his suffering patients. Reverend James Crawford used his final moments to deliver what observers described as a theatrical sermon about divine forgiveness, apparently still attempting to manipulate his audience even as he faced death. Sister Mary Crawford's life sentence was served at the Colorado Territorial Women's Prison, where she continued to maintain detailed journals describing her religious visions and her certainty that she had been chosen for a divine mission. Prison records indicate that she never showed any understanding that her actions had been criminal, and she spent her final years attempting to convert other inmates to her belief that death was a form of healing. She died in prison in 1923, still convinced that she had been an instrument of God's mercy. The aftermath of the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium case extended far beyond the trial and execution of the Crawford murderers. The discovery of systematic killing disguised as medical care sent shockwaves through American society, raising fundamental questions about the regulation of medical practice and the protection of vulnerable patients. More immediately, the case sparked a nationwide investigation into similar facilities that claimed to provide miraculous healing for terminal illnesses. The federal investigation into Mountain View's operations revealed a network of corruption that extended throughout Colorado territory and beyond. Sheriff Frank Jameson was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for his role in enabling the murders, while numerous other officials faced prosecution for accepting bribes or failing to investigate suspicious activities. The postal workers and telegraph operators who had helped maintain the deception received lesser sentences, but their prosecution sent a clear message that official corruption would not be tolerated. The financial investigation into the Crawfords' operation revealed that they had accumulated wealth equivalent to over $30 million in today's currency. Most of this money had been stolen from their murdered patients, but significant amounts had also been invested in legitimate businesses and properties across the Western territories. The federal government initiated a complex process of asset recovery, attempting to return stolen wealth to the families of victims while compensating the communities that had been affected by the Crawfords' crimes. The families of the 84 murdered patients faced the traumatic process of recovering and burying their loved ones' remains. The bodies found in the Mountain View crypt had been preserved by the dry mountain air and controlled temperature, allowing for identification in most cases. However, many families chose not to view the remains, preferring to remember their loved ones as they had been in life rather than as victims of systematic murder. The psychological impact on the families was devastating and long-lasting. Many had spent years believing that their loved ones were alive and well, serving God in the mountains and experiencing miraculous healing. The discovery that these same loved ones had actually been murdered within days or weeks of arriving at Mountain View created a form of traumatic grief that had no precedent in American society. Several family members required long-term psychiatric care to deal with the combination of grief, guilt, and horror that resulted from learning the truth about their relatives' fate. The Mountain View case also sparked a broader examination of religious healing practices and the regulation of facilities that claimed to provide medical care. State and territorial governments began implementing licensing requirements for medical facilities, mandatory reporting procedures for patient deaths, and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had occurred at Mountain View. These regulatory changes, while necessary, also created tensions with legitimate religious healing practices and raised complex questions about the relationship between faith and medicine. The abandoned Mountain View Healing Sanatorium became a source of continuing horror for the local community. The buildings, contaminated by years of systematic murder, were eventually burned to the ground by federal authorities in an attempt to eliminate the physical reminders of the crimes that had occurred there. However, the granite crypt system carved into the mountainside proved impossible to destroy completely, and local residents reported continuing disturbances in the area for decades after the facility's destruction. The site of the former sanatorium became known locally as Murder Mountain, and stories of supernatural activity began circulating within months of the facility's destruction. Travelers reported hearing screams and moans coming from the abandoned granite chambers, while others claimed to see lights moving through the ruins of the burned buildings. Whether these reports reflected genuine supernatural phenomena or simply the power of suggestion, fed by knowledge of the horrific crimes that had occurred there, they contributed to a lasting atmosphere of dread and horror surrounding the location. The professional medical community responded to the Mountain View case with a combination of horror and determination to prevent similar abuses. Medical schools began implementing stricter ethical training, while professional organizations developed oversight mechanisms designed to identify practitioners who might be abusing their positions of trust. The case became a standard study in medical ethics used to illustrate the potential for abuse when medical authority is combined with religious manipulation and geographic isolation. The legal precedents established by the Crawford trial influenced criminal prosecution for decades, providing prosecutors with frameworks for addressing systematic abuse of professional authority and the exploitation of vulnerable populations. The case demonstrated that crimes committed under the guise of professional care could be prosecuted as premeditated murder rather than malpractice, establishing important principles that would be applied to future cases involving medical abuse. Perhaps most significantly, the Mountain View case revealed the deadly potential that existed when legitimate authority figures, doctors, religious leaders, and medical professionals chose to exploit their positions of trust for personal gain. The Crawfords had been able to commit their crimes precisely because they possessed the credentials and authority that made people trust them with their lives. This realization led to fundamental changes in how American society approached the regulation and oversight of professional authority, particularly in contexts where vulnerable people might be exploited. The story of the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of questioning authority, maintaining oversight of professional practice, and protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation. The 84 people who died in those Colorado mountains were not just victims of individual criminals, but casualties of a system that failed to protect them from systematic abuse disguised as care and healing. The final entry in the Mountain View case files, written by Marshal Thomas Garrison, captured the lasting impact of the investigation. In 20 years of law enforcement, I have never encountered a case that combined such systematic evil with such elaborate deception. The Crawford murderers did not simply kill their victims. They corrupted the very concepts of healing, faith, and mercy that should protect society's most vulnerable members. Their crimes represent not just individual evil, but a fundamental betrayal of everything that civilized society holds sacred. Today, the site of the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium remains unmarked and largely forgotten, hidden in the Colorado Rockies, where snow covers the granite chambers that once housed the bodies of 84 murder victims. The official records of the case remain sealed in federal archives, accessible only to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic interest in the crimes. But the story of what happened in those mountains between 1883 and 1888 stands as one of the most chilling examples of systematic murder in American history. The families of the victims have long since passed away, taking with them the personal memories of loved ones who traveled to Colorado, seeking healing and found only death. But their story continues to serve as a warning about the dangers that exist. When desperation meets deception, when faith becomes a weapon, and when the people we trust most with our lives choose to become our killers. What do you think about this horrifying chapter in American history? Could systematic murder on this scale happen again in our modern world? Or have we developed sufficient safeguards to prevent such atrocities? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story has left you as disturbed as it should, share it with someone who appreciates true historical mysteries. Don't forget to subscribe for more dark stories from America's hidden past, because the shadows of history hold secrets that we ignore at our own peril. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who wear the faces of healers, teachers, and protectors. I hope you will like this story very much. To see and tell such stories, subscribe to my channel.